Well, hello everybody and welcome back. As always, it's really nice to have you here. In this tutorial, we're going to be focusing our attention on the curtain asset that we imported in our previous tutorial. If you'll remember, we used the awesome Chaos Cosmos to bring in this curtain asset, and it came in with a bunch of really cool production-ready materials applied to it. That's fine and dandy, but this is a tutorial series. So what we'll be doing here is we're going to be deleting all of these fabric materials that came with the curtain, and we're going to be creating our own one from complete scratch. Okay, so that's the goal for this tutorial. We're going to learn how to create a pretty solid curtain material from the ground up. All right, cool. So let's set up a bit of a render region. Okay, so just so we focus all that rendering power into this region. And then what we're going to do is we're going to want to bring in a V-Ray material. I'm going to use a standard V-Ray material. If you want, you can use the node material. That's perfectly fine. Okay. Then I'm going to rename this material to be called curtain material. And I'm also going to apply it to our curtain there. All right, there we go. Now, the first thing that we'll probably want to set up here is this material's color. Okay, so for that, we're going to go under the diffuse channel and we're going to set up the diffuse color parameter here. Okay, so let's just try to make this curtain be, well, maybe this sort of blue looking material. So something like this, I think would look really well. So from a compositional standpoint, we're just adding some of that color contrast. As you can see, you know, it's a pretty vivid blue color here that kind of stands out, but not too much, right? So I think this blue color here will work fine for us here. Now, if you do have a fabric texture, you can plug it into the texture slot here. Okay, play around maybe with the mix strength to adjust how it mixes with the color here. You can do all that. We won't here because we're kind of happy with the result that we have here. But for that extra realism, if you have a fabric texture, just plug it into the texture slot here. Okay, but for us, we're kind of done with the diffuse channel as is. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing on our list, which is the reflection channel. Now, every material in the real world has some sort of a reflection property. Okay, and that includes fabric materials as well. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go under the color parameter here, and we're just going to tune it all the way up to fully enable those reflections. Now, obviously, these reflections are very mirror-like. So what we're going to want to do here is we're going to want to play around with the glossiness parameter. So this is a fabric material, and fabric materials typically have really soft reflections to them or really rough reflections to them. Okay, kind of depends on what kind of terminology you like to use. Either way, the reflections on fabric materials are not super glossy. So we're going to lower the glossiness down to 0.1 here, and I think that's going to work great for us as is. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, hey, you know, we've turned up the reflections, but then we've made the reflections super duper rough. So does having reflections even matter in this case? Well, you know, if you're wondering that, just take a look at the material preview here, okay? And we're gonna we're gonna disable the reflections here, okay? And check that out. There is that nice, subtle, but quite apparent difference to our material compared to, you know, when we have the reflections turned on versus when we don't have any reflections on our material. And so that's a pretty important touch of realism you can add to your materials. And as you can see, even fabric materials that have a really low glossiness value, even these types of materials exhibit a visual change when you turn reflections to on. They just look a lot softer, a lot more realistic. Okay. Now, again, if you have a fabric glossiness texture, feel free to plug it into the glossiness texture slot here. We won't, but if you do have it, you know, it will add some extra realism to your material here. Okay. Okay, cool. All right, so now what we're going to focus on next here is the Sheen channel, okay? But before we actually do that, we're going to move our curtain asset here into a more simplified scene. Why are we going to do that? Well, sometimes that's just what you do in production. Because say, for example, if we now turn Sheen to on, okay, as you can see, you know, this is a bit of a heavy scene to render out. We have We have the shadow planes that are blocking the light coming into our scene. We have a lot of materials in our scene here. Bottom line, this scene is an interior, and interiors do need some more rendering power to render. And, it's kind of hard to kind of see all the changes that you're making to your materials, especially if these are sort of these smaller changes, right? Smaller tweaks. It's hard to see how exactly it all kind of updates, because things do need a second or two to render out. Okay, so what you sometimes do in production in these types of situations, okay, when you're dealing with these a bit more slower to render scenes, well, what you do is you take your asset, you copy it, so Control C or Command C if you're on Mac, you copy them into a simplified scene of some sorts. Okay, so we have one prepared here. It's called a curtain material development scene. So we're just going to copy and paste this this curtain asset along with its material into this simpler scene. So let's now stop the interactive render and let's restart it in this new scene. Okay, and so look at this. This scene is super simplified. It's just using an HDRI that's plugged into a dome light to light our scene. And then we also have the sphere light at the back of the curtain. And we're going to explain why we're using the sphere light here in just a couple of minutes. But the point here is that you can clearly see that now, this scene is super fast to render. It's pretty much basically real time. We don't even have the denoiser enabled because it renders so fast. So now, when we're editing our material here, all of these changes, we're going to be able to see them real quickly here as we tweak these parameters. Okay, so that's the idea here. So let's go back to the Sheen parameter here. So what Sheen actually is, or what it does is, it's basically, it adds that nice little sort of micro strand effect to your materials. So if you can imagine a sofa fabric material typically has these micro strands poking out of it. These are really tiny strands that would make no sense to model them, but they do create this sort of a realistic effect where if you take a look at your fabric material under grazing angles, okay, you're going to see those strands catch highlights. So it's just going to make your fabric materials look more realistic because they're going to have that nice little fuzziness to them. Okay, so that's what the Sheen parameter does here. Now, how do you set it up? Well, the Sheen color parameter is probably the most important parameter because, by default, it comes in set with a black color, which means, that the Sheen, layer, if you will, is totally turned off. Now, to enable it, you just, you give the Sheen some color, and there you go. You have a Sheen effect going. And as you can see, it just adds that nice little softness along those sort of grazing angles, where those micro strands would catch those highlights. Okay. Now, with the Sheen color, how you want to set it up is those micro strands typically have a bit of a color to them that's, derived from the diffuse color of your material. So we're going to go under the diffuse channel here, and we're going to copy the color parameters, and we're going to paste it into the Sheen color parameter. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to mess with the values here. So because Sheen is basically this highlight looking effect, we're going to want to tone down on that color. This totally depends on the type of material that you're trying to recreate. Okay, but typically these Sheen effects do have just a little bit color to them. Okay, but again, it does depend on the type of material that you're trying to recreate. So we're going to go with a saturation of 11% here, maybe. And then as far as the strength itself goes, 100% kind of seems a little too strong to me. Okay, let's maybe get a little bit closer to our curtain here. Yeah, 100% seems a little bit too strong. So maybe if we lower it down to, say, 70% or so, I think this looks great. And again, just check this out, how much more realistic our fabric material here now looks like. So we're adding that nice little softness to our fabric material. Now just check this out. We're gonna disable the Sheen effect here. Just check out what kind of a difference this is. Okay, so this is without Sheen. This is with sheen. We're just adding that nice little realistic effect to it with the sheen layer. Okay. Now, let's just lower the effect down to maybe, let's maybe go with 80% here. Yeah, this looks pretty cool. Okay. Now, if we have some sort of a dirt texture or something like that, you can plug it into the texture slot here. That's just going to break the sheen effect up a little bit. You know, it's going to add some imperfections to it. So, for example, if somebody kind of rubbed their hands, their fingers on this curtain, that would probably make some of these micro strands stand out a little bit more, catch more highlights and others less. You know, that's what you do with the texture slot here. Okay. But now there's another parameter in here that's also really important. That's the sheen glossiness. So if we lower the sheen glossiness, observe what's going to happen in our material preview here. You know, our sheen effect is just going to get a lot more fuzzier, a lot broader, if you will. But if we up the glossiness, it's going to get a lot narrower. So it's only going to be visible under those extreme sort of grazing angles, if you will. So I think for the type of effect that we're going to go here, maybe we could try a value of 0.7. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good as it is. And obviously you're encouraged to play a lot, to play with these parameters here, because, you know, this really adds that nice little touch of realism to your fabric materials. Okay, cool. Now, the next thing that we're going to tackle here is a really important aspect of every curtain material, and that is its translucency. Okay, if you take a look at your typical curtains in the real world, you'll probably notice that they have a sort of a translucent effect to them, where the light coming through the window that's behind them is not totally fully blocked by the curtains, and instead the light travels through the curtains, producing that soft lighting that ultimately enters your room. Now, to set up the translucency effect, all you need to do is you need to go under the refraction channel here, and you need to turn translucency to on here. But before we actually go and do just that, let's quickly inspect our curtain model here. Okay, so if we get a little bit closer to it, and if we go into the polygon mode here, you're going to see that our curtain model here is basically made up of these single-sided polygons. This is not an enclosed mesh. This object basically has no internal volume. It's just made up of these thin polygons. And that's typically how most of your curtain assets will be modeled, okay? Because that makes a lot of sense, because you know, curtains typically are not very thick, so we can sort of simulate that internal volume instead of wasting our time modeling it and adding extra polygons to our scene, which would, you know, result in a bigger strain on our hardware. Specifically, you know, you need to load those extra polygons into your system memory, which means you need more system memory, etc., etc. So this is how your typical curtain asset will be modeled, and because it's modeled like that, as we said, we're going to have to simulate that internal volume, okay? It's super thin, but it still needs to be simulated. And you can do that by toggling this refract thinned wall parameter here to on, okay? Now that we've toggled this parameter to on, we can start setting up our translucency. So we're going to go under the translucency type parameter here, and we're going to set it to subsurface scattering, okay? And immediately you're going to see that now we have the subsurface scattering effect happening. Look at that, right? It's obviously way too strong, so let's mess with its amount here. Okay, so maybe we can lower it down to 0.2. Maybe we can go down to 0.1. That kind of doesn't, maybe we could go back to 0.2. Okay, right. Now, there's still one thing that's kind of off here. Oh, and actually before we continue, hopefully now you can see why we have this sphere light in our scene here as well. You know, we're just having that bright light source behind our curtain, so we can see this translucency effect, this subsurface scattering effect, a little bit more pronounced, right? So that's the beauty of these simple scenes here. They're easy to render, and you can really control the lighting variables in these types of scenes, right? Right. Okay, now the next parameter that we're gonna want to tweak here is going to be the subsurface scattering color parameter, because as you can see right now, this curtain kind of looks like the inside of the curtain is white, but you know, that's kind of a weird thing because we know that this material has this blue color to it. Okay, so we're gonna want to set up the subsurface scattering color here to something a bit more bluish. So again, we're going to go under the diffuse channel here. We're going to copy the color and we're going to paste it into the subsurface color slot or parameter here. Now, all we have to do at this point is just mess with these values here. So maybe we could lower the saturation a little bit here. Okay, we don't want it to be too saturated. Maybe we could play with the value. Okay, and maybe something. Oh, let's play around with this a little bit more. Maybe something like this could look pretty cool. Maybe a saturation of 35%, a value maybe of 60%. Let's kind of take a look at this thing from different angles. And I think this is looking pretty cool. Obviously, the translucency sort of effect kind of depends on the type of fabric that you're trying to recreate, depends on the curtains that you're looking at in the real world. But, you know, this is the workflow that you want to adhere to. All right, now before we sort of start concluding this tutorial, there's one more thing that we're going to show you how you can set up, and that is that see-through aspect of curtain materials. Because, you know, sometimes you can see through these curtain materials because you can see through the little space that's between the individual strands that the curtain fabric is made up of. Okay, now to set that up, we're going to go under the diffuse channel here, and we're going to bring in a fabric opacity texture. Okay, sometimes you can derive these from diffuse textures. You just need to make them black and white. Other times, you know, your assets will be supplied with them. All right, now we're going to drag our texture here into the opacity texture slot here. And now, immediately you're going to see that things are not mapped correctly because we just can't see the texture at all. So let's set up our mapping. Okay, so we're going to click on the material tag here. We're going to go under projection, and then we're going to select cubic here. Now, cubic isn't necessarily the best option here. The curtain isn't a straight up flat mesh after all. UVW mapping would be better, but only if our curtain asset would have been properly UV unwrapped. That said, because we won't be doing close-up shots of the curtain anyway, I think we'll get away with cheating a little bit here, and we'll just use cubic mapping. All right, now, there we go. Now we got something happening. But obviously, the mapping is, well, things are a little bit too big. So let's lower the length U and V values, maybe down to 50%. Maybe we can go even lower, down to 30%. All right, I think that's looking pretty cool. But now, obviously, the opacity map is it's a little bit too strong. So what we're gonna do next here is we're gonna use a V-Ray bitmap. Okay, we're gonna nest it on top of the texture that we imported. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna play with the color offset parameter here. Okay, we're just gonna wanna offset this color by a huge amount, I think. All right, there we go. Maybe a little bit more even. Okay, we're just visually inspecting what's happening in the interactive render. Okay, so maybe this is a little bit too much. Maybe 97% here will look fine. Okay, and now look at that. That's looking pretty cool. Now, what we could also do is we could lower the filter blur value here in the V-Ray bitmap, just because, you know, we don't want to filter out these tiny details there in the bitmap. So typically what I personally like to do is I want to push the filter blur down to 0.1. You can push it to 0. That might cause some problems here and there, but typically a 0.1 value is something that I personally default to. And look at that. Look at how cool that is looking. So if we take a look at our curtain assets, our curtain asset here from a different angle, maybe we turn off the sphere light. Look at that. That's looking pretty darn realistic, isn't it? Okay, yeah, that's looking pretty cool. If we turn the sphere light on again, no, we're just inspecting how this material looks like. This is a pretty controlled environment. And I think we're kind of done with our curtain material here. Obviously, again, you could still tweak it. You could plug additional diffuse texture maps in here, reflection glossiness maps, maybe even a sheen dirt map, and so on and so forth. But, you know, I think this will work just fine for us here. So we're done with this asset. Let's stop the interactive renderer. Let's copy the curtain and let's paste it back into our main scene. Now we already have the curtain in here, you know, because we started working on it before we copied it into the other scene. So let's just delete it. Let's delete its material as well. And let's just paste the sort of finished assets from the other scene back into this one. Okay, and because we haven't moved it, our curtain is exactly where it needs to be. So now if we start the interactive render, give it a second to load up. And now you're going to see our curtain asset in its full glory. Okay, there we go. All right. Now, obviously, you know, there's ways to optimize this asset for speed, and you kind of can't do much when it comes to the reflections. You need those because they'll make your materials look super realistic. There's not a whole lot you can do by turning the sheen effect off. You obviously also need the translucency effect as well. It's pretty key. But one effect that you could do without potentially is that see-through opacity effect that we've set up. Okay, now it is a super realistic effect, but you know, if you want to optimize your scenes, and if you're not going to look at these assets up close, because as you can see from where we're standing right now, we can't see through those strands anyway. So we don't really need to have the renderer calculate the opacity on this material now, do we? Right? If we go up close, we're probably going to need it for that extra realism. But because we're not planning to do that, at least not just yet, what we can do is we can just disable this effect, still have it in here. We can toggle it back to on if we need to. But, you know, for optimization purposes, to kind of get a little bit more of that extra speed, hey, why not just have it be disabled right now? Because we're not going to see the effect anyway. And that's just a bit of an optimization technique, if you will. Obviously, you decide what's best for you. Okay, all right. So thank you for tuning into this one. This one was all about this curtain material here. Well, you know what? Before we actually conclude the tutorial, let's organize our scene. Let's nest this material under a curtains 001 material layer here. And now, you know, we can start concluding this tutorial. Now, obviously, you are encouraged to add to the material we've created here. If you add diffuse maps, glossiness maps, and even bump maps, you'll add even more realism in there. So you're definitely encouraged to continue playing with the material here. For the scene we're building up in this tutorial series, however, this curtain material will do just fine. And so with that, thank you for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye, everybody.